And Christians, when they talk about hope, I think that we're talking about essentially two things that are closely tied together. We are saying on the one hand that God and his plans will not ultimately be frustrated by anything that created reality can do. But also to recognize, well, God reconciling all things is actually, first of all, happening sort of in history, right? The sort of breaking in of the kingdom of God. Part of our hope is that God will work in and through the work that we do to bring about the redemption that he is working in all things.
Absolutely.
But not necessarily ever in ways that we could foresee. For me, that means that you can be deeply pessimistic and fully hopeful as a Christian. Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. In this episode, Barney and I wrap up our AI series by discussing some of our takeaways from the discussions, some lingering questions that we have, and we finally get to talk in more detail about what we mean by hope and what it means to confront challenges like AI with something like Christian hope. So I hope you enjoy.
Hello and welcome to Faith at the Frontiers. And in this episode is just Austin and me. Hi, Austin.
Hello, good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. And we are wrapping up our AI series, thinking about some of our main takeaways, stuff we've learned from interviewing all of these experts on AI. So, Austin, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. I was thinking about some of the various takeaways, things that I appreciated. One of the concepts that I think I've been using a lot in my own thinking since we've had these discussions is from Autumn Rittenauer, this idea of a digital empire that she's taken from Augustine. I found that really, really fruitful for just reflecting on not so much AI as a tool, but sort of how does this kind of digital empire, which AI is an increasingly big part of, sort of shape our existence, and how do we as Christians stand in relation to it? Yeah, so I've just found myself sort of reaching for that concept quite a bit. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so we think of AI as a digital empire, although Autumn Rittenauer, is a brilliant episode. She was mainly thinking about social media, wasn't she? Mm-hmm. So we're sort of transferring that concept, which was already transferred from Augustine's use of just empire in general. How do you understand the analogy between like an actual empire that Augustine's talking about and AI?
Yeah, so I think there's probably various ways that we could do this, and she probably does this in more detail than I am, but in her book. But I think the basic idea that we sometimes talk about something like social media. We could talk about Facebook. We could talk about Instagram, or we could talk about ChatGPT. We talk about these things as if they're like individual tools that we as individuals are choosing to use how we want to choose them, as if we sort of have, this kind of ultimate free will, and we needed to just make, have the power to make these decisions and build our own, lives or destiny or whatever. And I think thinking in terms of digital empire is just saying we are embedded in massive structures of power, of wealth, of all of these kinds of things that wield immense sort of power over the shape of our lives, the shape of our communities. And we have actually sort of a limited power over them, right? We can kind of choose to engage them sometimes, but even like AI, for instance, right? A lot of jobs these days sort of force you to use AI. A lot of people have jobs where they're forced to use social media. And also people sort of always face with social media the question of like, if I refuse to be on social media and that's where all the people are that I care about, right? Then I struggle to connect.
Yeah, there's
with
a
them.
softer sort of forcing or a compelling where you're severely disadvantaged if you don't use these tools.
That's right. Yeah. And they just shape how so many things work, right? I think that even if you're not using them and you're fine with that, they're deeply shaping our culture, our politics, our economics. And so I think thinking in those terms helps us get closer to what's actually at stake in these questions. And also easier to say, this isn't a question of sort of how do I as an individual decide to use this tool, but sort of how do we as communities position ourselves in relation to this empire, which I think is the kind of Augustinian thing. And I find that especially, when thinking about AI, I'm always thinking I'm not really interested in how am I going to use AI, but how are my students going to be sort of protected from the ways that the things that AI is sort of shaping them, or what it's taking away from them, right? Or, these kind of broader communities, like how are we going to together engage and face the way that this massive sort of upheaval is going to sort of shape our lives. So I
that's
find
right.
that like
So
a really
training
fruitful...
everybody in responsible use of AI.
Yeah, and just recognizing, like, for instance, we can't expect young people to have the individual willpower to not use AI to cheat on, if we're thinking of like teaching.
I remember there was something you said in one of the episodes that basically you just said you tell your students all of the reasons why it's better for them if they don't use AI on their research papers, and they sort of agree with you, but then they still do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And because it's like I recognize if I was in their shoes, I would do it as a young person. If I didn't have to write an essay, I would have never written an essay in my life. I hated writing essays. And so if there was an easy button I could push to not ever write an essay, I absolutely would have taken that option every single time.
Even though you knew that it would like inhibit your learning.
Absolutely.
It's a bit like
that's
smoking,
kind of where they're
right?
at.
Everybody knows that smoking is bad for you, but then still a lot of people do it.
Yeah, it's like, we've piled up mountains of cocaine around them and said, don't use cocaine. It's really bad for you. But here, sit in a pile of it all day. And it's like, just it's silly to expect them. And really, I think it's immoral for us to say, this is all on you to figure out what you're going to do, instead of saying it's our responsibility to guide you and protect you from your own worst impulses.
I think that's right. And I think that's a really important point, because some of the reactions to AI I've seen in academia have been this extremely curmudgeonly sort of reactionary, just forbid, ban all of it. Students are not allowed to use any, and we just have to trust them that they're not going to. And we're going to penalize them, like expel them if they are seen to use any AI at all. And I just think, that's placing too heavy a burden on these students to make it all on them, as you say, and then to assign assignments that would be so much easier if AI was used for them.
Yeah, and I think, the other place that this is difficult is I often think as a faculty, higher education is already in a kind of crisis point of decline in many ways, which is why AI is making such easy use of it and transforming it. And, I think universities should be able to band together much more broadly and say, this is how we are all going to address this. But instead, it's been, well, if you as an individual professor don't want your students using AI for all their assignments, then you figure that out. But otherwise, everyone's kind of all in on just do whatever. And so you're also kind of in a place where there's, any one individual, whether they're a faculty or a student, has very limited options when it comes to like, what are we going to do with this? And I think that's true in broader workplaces and, in society. If there's not kind of collective responses, then it's just the corporations and the individuals who own them are going to decide what these things mean for us, and we're just going to follow along and see what happens.
I mean, it's still such early days. We're like 3 years into the AI revolution, and I was mindful of what our first interviewee said, Josh Lawman, that it's like the first few years of the internet, right? When people are still using Yahoo and Alta Vista, and nobody had heard of Google. And it was very clunky. You look back at it now, and it was very, very clunky and strange and absurd in some ways. And we're perhaps at that stage with AI right now. We don't know what's going to arise out of this sort of chaos and confusion that we're in at the moment. And there may be some more sensible policies that emerge. I'm at least hopeful that some of those things will emerge.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, this is the problem, is that, right, we have like federal legislation saying that you're not allowed to legislate AI for the next decade and things like this. So there's so much money behind this that it's kind of like everyone who has any stake in it is making sure that we cannot in any way have any sensible legislation, but we will simply put all the money into it and go as fast as we can. Those are the kinds of things that make me think that's unlikely to happen, that anything we're going to have sort of sensible responses. I don't feel optimistic in that sense.
Yeah, well, fair enough. I mean, that's a whole element of this that, as you said, has been somewhat under discussed. the distribution of power and the distribution of knowledge by people in power, and how they can shape and control what knowledge is disseminated and what constitutes and counts as knowledge, is a very significant factor. I mean, we should probably make sense of this step by step. Like, can you guide, for somebody who's skeptical and who thinks, how is AI controlling knowledge? Surely I can just ask it anything and it can tell me what I want, and it's just mining the internet for resources. How would you persuade somebody that there are actually tech billionaires controlling what they know through AI?
I mean, the first thing just to say is that it's, before the question of kind of what's the output of a given chat bot or something, is just the fact that our economy is so heavily leveraged in AI. This is the AI bubble that everyone's talking about, right? The valuation that is given is such that it's going to have to start making way more money than all of the tech companies combined have ever made through social media and previous sort of iterations of these things, which means AI is going to be put into every single possible thing and shoved down your throat in every single possible way for the foreseeable future. And right now it's relatively affordable and fun to use, but it's going to become massively expensive. It's going to be a huge expenditure for every employer, for every company, right? Like, theoretically, you're going to see a big portion of your salary going to AI in some sense if this valuation is going to hold. So either our economy is going to collapse or this is going to be pushed in that sense.
Gosh, that's pretty doom and gloom.
I mean, I don't know. This is just what I've heard economists saying, is like, that's the only, I can't imagine how else these things can sort of carry out their current valuations. And people have a lot to lose to make sure that does get carried forward. And so if that becomes the case, right, this is a facet of every single part of your life. And then also to say it's not regulated at all, it's regulated way less than so many of these other technologies we've been talking about, and there's massive political power behind saying it can't be regulated, then it's just a black box. Like, how people don't know how these things are being run and actually controlled, and what sort of code is determining how it's engaging with you and who's making those decisions. And so if it's going to become that powerful with this much, this little oversight. And we've just learned this, we're learning this, like social media is a good example of this, where like Meta is finally getting sued by a bunch of countries for all of the stuff that it's been doing for a very long time. That was, deeply nefarious. And so we're just at the beginning of, that times 1,000, I think, with AI in terms of how these things are functioning. And that seems to me like the actual question. And then like, yeah, sure. I think there's no reason to think that some of those people can't control what output you get when you ask AI something going forward.
Well, I mean, they already control it in so many different ways, because that's what all of the poor Africans having to test it and regulate it, getting lots of obscene or disgusting or like horrific outputs from AI, and then just pressing various buttons saying, no, this is not acceptable. This shouldn't be part of what AI ever produces. That is shaping its sort of the kinds of answers it's going to give you. And if it can be shaped in that way, which in ways that most human beings would agree that it shouldn't give certain answers and that kind of stuff, there's no preventing it from being shaped in certain moral and ideological directions, so that the kinds of answers it gives always lean in a certain political direction or a certain ethical direction or a certain religious direction, perhaps,
Yeah, that's right. I mean, yeah, we know that algorithms on social media have substantially shaped elections, a lot of things. And this is just a much more powerful form of this, because it's not just shaping what information you see, but how information itself is even getting kind of developed and disseminated, especially if you have increasingly few people who have actually been educated, and most of them all just know how to use AI, right? That's the sort of striking combination of what could be.
But again, I think I would want to push back a little bit and say, not push back against what we've actually said, but contextualize it and say, I don't think it's really quite as new as all that the rich and powerful control what counts as knowledge and how knowledge is disseminated. I think in many ways that's been the case through all of human history since the beginning of societies, right? The rich and powerful were the ones who determined what people learned in education, They gave messages about the emperor or the Caesar or the pharaoh being your protector, your provider, and or even your god, and you need to worship him or whatever. And that was how they controlled societies and made sure that they remained rich and powerful and built their empires on the backs of all of these slaves.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly not a new phenomenon. I think there's maybe an argument to be made that this is a kind of ramped up version of that. But even if it's not, it's sort of like the story we tell ourselves about modern society is that we've moved away from that. But actually, I think we're just diving headlong into that even more than humans experienced it in the past. That's what's weird about this, I think, is that everyone thinks, oh, these things are going to give us, free access to knowledge and free will and blah, blah, blah. But I think that's mostly not what's happening. I think it's mostly doing the opposite
Sure. Well, I
of
think
that.
the internet in general universalized a lot of publication. People could self-publish. People could put their own ideas out there without them being regulated through normal channels. And even though that led to a huge amount of absolute drivel and nonsense coming out on the internet, perhaps that was just the price to pay for a sort of democratization of knowledge. Things like Wikipedia, I think, were quite a positive force in just giving people free access to a lot of information, which you could argue it had some ideological basis for it, but ultimately it did allow people to quickly acquire facts and information that were largely undisputed. And if it was disputed, then Wikipedia would often be upfront about that. So
well, that's where this is moving in the opposite direction, though, right? Is
perhaps
insofar as that did, then quickly people realized actually we could make money by controlling through algorithms, not, here's all the knowledge, but here's what we want you to see because it sells well. Right. Which arguably that's, it didn't say like access whatever you'd like. It said, here's the stuff that everybody wants. Here's what's popular. Which is mostly stuff that makes you angry and stuff that's, that's kind of what the internet's done. And this is just, instead of Googling things, right, it's even more powerful than an algorithm, arguably, as if you're going to use AI. Right.
Well, it can create your own personal echo chamber by telling you what you want. What you want to hear, what it's judged that you want to hear. So it can be sort of the ultimate sort of narcissism in that sense.
Yeah.
Right. And you're right. It's sort of an extension of the classic algorithm, the social media algorithm. I remember a story that really illustrated this of a lady who was convinced that there was massive Christian revival going on around the world. That was because every time she opened YouTube, all of the videos that it offered her were videos about revivals. And that must have been because one time she clicked on a video about revival and then the YouTube algorithm thought, oh, these are the kinds of things she wants. So we're going to give her all of these things.
Yes.
And that's just an illustration, right? I remember once clicking on one YouTube video about somebody who was planning to convert to Catholicism. And then for the next few months, I got tons of videos offered to me about people becoming Catholic, which if I hadn't known the statistics that far more people are becoming Protestant than becoming Catholic, if I'd only looked at YouTube, I'd have really thought that the whole world was becoming Catholic.
Exactly. And I often, recently, I think I clicked on a news story about, some crime that happened kind of near me, but then it was like, oh, you want to know about every single crime that has happened to like children in all of the world. And this, I'm like, how many parents is this their whole feed of like, oh no, all these horrible things are happening to children. We're terrified. We need to, which is how many parents talk about, right? Is like, oh my gosh, our whole society is, and like the statistics of crime are actually sort of the opposite, but you sort of get, surrounded by these and you're terrified.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of thing, AI could certainly do, I think, to a whole nother level.
It can. Well, I would say perhaps it's a new angle and it's perhaps an intensification of certain ways that the rich and powerful can control information and determine knowledge. But I wouldn't argue that it's a radical departure from anything we've seen before. And because of that, I see signs for hope in that. Like we've seen forms of resistance appear. We've seen forms of undercurrents of knowledge, and we've seen ways that communities can reorganize themselves and find alternative narratives. That's happened constantly throughout history, and I just think it's going to happen again. Of course, that doesn't mean we don't need to put effort into it. Doesn't mean it's not going to come at a cost, but it does mean that we're not dealing with this unprecedented monster that will just destroy everything.
No, I mean, I certainly think, but And, the other big piece of this is a lot of people are talking about the number of jobs that are going to be lost through AI. And if that is, the numbers that some people are assuming, then that requires a whole new social contract. That's not like, oh, let's adjust some things. That's like you've put out, of work a massive percentage of, say white collar workers or whatever across the entire country, and now they don't have any jobs. So you can certainly get through that, but it's something like a revolution, right? Like
yeah, sure. But from an economics perspective, I sympathize with people's worries and concerns there, and I can see how it would be really, really hard for a lot of people. But at the same time, that's not a new situation either. Think about with the invention of the electric light, thousands and thousands of candle makers lost their jobs. Or with the invention of the car, thousands and thousands of people who worked with horses lost their jobs. And yes, that was tragic and awful for those people. But I'm not going to go and say, oh, we should have carried on using candles to try and support those candle makers. Society does just sort of have to shift, and those people end up finding new jobs. And the reason they find new jobs is because that's how the economy works, right? If a
But that's
machine
not
can do
how the
something
economy
for
works
you.
anymore, right?
Okay.
So on the one hand, all of those people, if they were able to retrain, they went from doing meaningful work to working on an assembly line, which is largely not meaningful work because you're not even putting together a whole thing. You're sort of doing one little piece. And a lot of people have argued that that was kind of, a moment of radical dehumanization of the workforce, which I agree with. But also that increasingly, right, you have this wealth inequality that's such an extreme that money does not go back into the economy and create jobs. It just goes and it gets offshored by the billionaires. And so you have, right, and they're not replacing this with other kinds of jobs, right? The candle makers are being replaced with light bulb makers, whereas this is just people being replaced by robots. So there's not another job coming out of that. It's just less jobs so that you can increase the money going to the shareholders. The whole point is to pay less people. That's why they're going to use AI to do it. And so that was not why they used light bulbs. That's not why they invented cars. They weren't trying to use less people to make money as a corporation. They were just giving us a different technology. Whereas the whole point of AI, it's not that AI is even going to do these jobs better. It mostly will do them worse, I think. It's just that they can pay less people to do the work.
Sure, but even what you're saying there suggests that this isn't a new situation. Like people who had more meaningful jobs got less meaningful jobs from the Industrial Revolution onwards, which means we've had hundreds of years of having to deal with these same problems.
But we've never replaced such a huge percentage of the workforce not with people.
Yeah,
right?
but
That's what's every time in the past it was replacing them still with people to some degree, whereas this is just cutting the people out of the equation.
Okay, but imagine that being 100% successful and robots do end up doing all of the work for human beings. Does like all of the work that human beings don't want to do, isn't that a kind of utopia? Nobody has to work.
Well,
So
in a
everybody can
different, I
still
mean, yeah,
just-
in a different sort of political reality, it could be, right? But we live in, especially in the U.S., right? Like no one's going to get universal basic income. That's not going to ever be on the table here. And so if the economic gain from the robots doing the work from us is not going to the people, but it's going to like 400 individuals, those people just take the money and go find a place to live where we're not going to bother them. Right? Like that doesn't help any of us.
But they still want to use the money somehow, right?
They don't necessarily seem to.
I don't know. I mean, even if they invest, they're not just taking the money out of the economy altogether. And if they were, then that would produce financial deflation and money would actually become more valuable. If they're investing the money somehow, then the money is still working for them in some regard. And that means that it's going back into the economy and fueling something.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the point is that it increasingly isn't doing that. It's certainly not fueling anything that's sort of supporting the vast majority of people in the country. That's my take, at least. But I think it's obvious that if this goes the direction that it could, that just leads to economic collapse. But the people who benefited off of it would just not suffer the economic collapse. And then you have to kind of start over. But that's kind of what 2008 was in some ways.
Yeah, that's happened before.
Yeah. But again, not to this degree. That's the kind of question.
Well, we're going to find out. You're a bit more doom and gloom than I am about this. Like, I'm recognizing that there are challenges, but I'm not seeing these challenges as unprecedented.
Yeah, and the question of unprecedented, I think, is, I'm not saying that it's like, I mean, even if it's just quantitatively different and not qualitatively different, like quantitatively different times 1,000 is still enough to radically reshape civilization in a way that something that was not
Well, I
qualitatively
guess I'm
different
not
but much
convinced that
smaller.
it's that quantitatively different either.
Yeah.
But we're going to find out. We don't need to speculate. We're all going to find out.
Yeah, well, and so that's where I think it's interesting to me how much, in our conversations that wasn't as front and center. It wasn't in a few of them, but I sort of expected it to be a much more prominent part of these discussions, which I think is interesting. The sort of large scale political and ethical ramifications of this.
Yeah. One of the problems that we have talked about quite a bit is the way that AI changes our humanity, or it changes our engagement with the world and thus changes us. Do we want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was, I think a lot of the people we spoke to kind of got at this in different ways. And Carmody maybe said the most on this, but yeah, this idea that, the real question is just sort of how does this shift sort of our own sense of like what it means to be human and our own the reality of being human, right? How does sort of engagement with these things shape us, inform us, whether that's, I guess, through the kind of habits that it forms within us, through the way that we think about what it means to be rational. And I do think that there's so much to be said about that as a kind of major question this raises.
Yeah. And again, we can draw analogies from previous things that have happened, right? That people watched. I think there have been some actual scientific studies on brain development that show how, with the advent of Google, the brain's ability to record certain facts and information severely deteriorated, simply because you don't need to remember when the next daylight savings is. You can just type it into Google and get it like that. Or you don't need to calculate the difference between Celsius and Fahrenheit, because Google can just do it for you. And that could be seen as a scary, problematic issue. Or like Google Maps as well. I use Google Maps every time I'm in the car now, almost, unless I'm driving somewhere I've driven already 10 times. So I've lost the ability to navigate using a map. Is that a terrible tragedy? Is that a serious defect in my humanity? Or is it just rechanneling those cognitive resources towards more fruitful and more important avenues?
Yeah, and this is where I think AI is an interesting one, because I do think one of the things that it's doing is precisely that kind of work for us, but in the most fruitful and interesting avenues, right? So if AI is now going to write books for us and create art and do all of the like creative and thoughtful and most important things, then that maybe for me is where it's kind of like the worry. So it's not so much like, oh, am I offloading this like cognitive load onto something that can do this work for me in areas that don't matter, but now I can do that in areas that do matter. Does that begin to sort of have a more fundamental kind of impact on me as a person? And yeah, I think, and also like the cumulative question, like at some point, if we can offload literally every task our brain does, then is that become a problem? And yeah, what do we sort of do with that? I don't know. I mean, I do sometimes think like, wow, I literally could not find my way around my neighborhood without a computer. That seems like a bad thing. I mean, that's being facetious, but
yeah, I mean, I if I really saw it as a bad thing, then I probably should pay the cost of it, delete Google Maps from my phone, get out an old school physical map and try and navigate my way around. But I'm just not convinced that it's such a terrible thing that I can't navigate with a map. It hasn't affected my life so far. In an apocalypse, it might affect my life, but then it would also affect my life that I've never learned how to shoot an animal and kill it and cook it, and skin it and that kind of stuff. Because if there was an apocalypse, then I'd have to learn a whole lot of skills that I don't know, not just how to navigate.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I do think, sometimes people can be silly about this sense of like, you should be a fully formed survivalist, and if you're not, that's a problem. One thing that I think about how it affects our sense of self is like, I for a long time thought of myself as like a very skilled world traveler. And then I one time found myself in Poland and my phone wasn't working. And I got utterly lost and had no capability of finding my way or speaking to anyone or doing anything. And I realized, I don't think I actually am very talented. I think I've just always had an iPhone in my pocket.
Yeah. Again, it just depends on whether you're ever going to need those skills that are sort of atrophying. And if so, then the problem goes way, way further back, even than the internet. It goes all the way back to, supermarkets and agricultural revolution and all those kinds of things. We just depend on machines to do a whole lot of things for us that if those machines suddenly broke down, we'd be in serious trouble. So I think I approach AI from that sort of a perspective. And you're right that the problem with AI is that it's targeting things that people actually enjoy doing and want to do, like that very, very famous line that I saw everywhere for a few months. What is it? I want AI to do my laundry and dishes so I can do art and creative work rather than AI doing the art and creative work so that I can do laundry and dishes. It's that kind of a problem. But again, it's in the nature of AI, right, that it can't be genuinely creative. It's amalgamating resources that other human beings have already produced somewhere on the internet and just rearranging them and presenting them. Yeah. And so, in a sense, if you're not an expert in something, then you might be duped into thinking that it's being creative. My sister-in-law told me a story about how many people in her church are using AI to write their own worship songs right now. And they're writing all of these worship songs with AI.
Wow.
And she's like, ooh, I'm not sure how I feel about this. But the truth is, that is very quickly going to be shown to be not actually original or creative. That's one of those flash in the pan things that now that it's suddenly new, it's suddenly possible to do that, to write your own worship song using AI. It looks really cool. But in 10, 20 years' time, when everybody's been able to do that for years, everybody's going to know the difference between a worship song that was written by AI and a worship song that was written by an actual original creative human being.
But this is one of the things that so think about, earlier you said this thing about we're just at the very beginning of this. Think about, internet before anyone even knew about Google. So imagine that AI becomes way better than even your sort of pretty good human at that. Then is the result just that humans say, well, then we don't do music anymore because we can't do it as good as the robots. And so that's just a thing that we don't get to do because when we do it, it's mediocre and you can tell compared to how good AI does it. And then what does that do to kind of human culture?
I just can't imagine that happening. But
you keep saying that we can't imagine how things are going to go, but they're going to, what if AI gets that good? Then what does that mean?
It depends what you mean by getting that good. What is AI actually doing? And this is where I actually welcome the challenge of AI to help force us to think hard about what real creativity is.
Yeah. This is where the bigger question though is as a society, we've decided that creativity is primarily about what sells, right? That's how our economy works. That's how, say, the music industry, that's everyone has kind of reduced this to that. And so imagine that AI, it could say, hey, you really like this artist. Here's 1,000 songs in the style of that artist that sound just like them that you can just listen to forever and you don't need to wait for the new album. Right? Or, oh, you like this song, but you want it in the style of that, right? So perfectly catered to your desires and the things that you like and the artists you like and the kind of thing. I can imagine AI doing that and saying oh, you love Taylor Swift. Here's unlimited Taylor Swift songs.
Sure, but I don't even think that that's completely new. If I talk to used to talk to my friends 20, 30 years ago who were deeply into the music scene, who styled themselves as real musicians, real highly musically sensitive and that kind of stuff. And they just said that all of the chart pop songs that kept coming out on the top 20, all that basically sounded the same to them. They're just rehashings of the same kinds of chord sequences and the same kinds of lyrics about romantic love or whatever. And then there's nothing new and original about it. They used the word generic. I learned the word generic from musicians complaining about the most popular pop songs. Because they said, oh, that's just generic. In other words, there's nothing new or unique or original about that. It's just an artist copying a style and a genre that has been around for decades.
Well, and this is where I think, again, like, we're speculating a lot here, but those are for me, the interesting questions about what you've raised exactly is this question of sort of, well, what do we find meaningful in human life? And how can we ensure that when we're offloading the cognitive load for things, we're not offloading the cognitive load of the things that we find meaningful? There was an AI guy that said recently, like, no one likes having to learn the guitar. That's hard. So now AI can do the guitar for you, and no one's ever going to have to do that again because no one likes that. And all these musicians were like, wait a second, what? What do you mean no one likes that? Like, it's hard work, and it's deeply meaningful. But there are a lot of people that really believe that. They really believe that human life would be better if we didn't have to do hard things to learn how to, if we play the guitar or whatever. And so that, I think, is the question that people need to ask themselves is, well, what do I think is meaningful? What do I think it means to be human? And how are these things shaping that sense? But also, how do I protect those things?
Well, I think it's one thing I think it's meaningful is to work against poverty, to alleviate poverty. Is AI doing that?
So, yeah, my biggest problem with AI is I think it's going to deeply impoverish people even more ultimately. I think that's the main thing it's going to accomplish.
Well, then I've got
personally.
something as a human being to keep doing that AI is not doing. So I know I'm being quite perverse here, but I'm taking your criteria and I'm turning them around. Like, you know what? If AI is not actually alleviating poverty in the world, then there's still something that needs to be done. There's still really, really poor people. If it's this huge, big revolution that's going to transform the world and all that kind of stuff, but is it actually making the world a better place? Is it making people more equal? Is it making people in less desperate circumstances? Is it reducing climate change? No, it's actually exacerbating climate change.
Yeah.
The thing is, AI, at the end of the day, has to come into contact with the real physical world in some way, with people being hungry and needing vegetables. And I'm interested really in how AI affects some of those very, very basic, fundamental things that every human being needs to do and that AI can't replace. AI can't eat for me.
Yeah.
And AI can't produce a vegetable for me.
Yeah. And, I think we talked about this in one of the episodes. Like, for me, it's more about like in AI isn't just a question on its own, but AI in this culture, in this political sphere, in this economy, with these people in charge, what is that going to do? And what does that mean that we're going to have to do? And it seems to me like, AI could, radically exacerbate the wealth gap and deeply impoverish huge numbers of people who are completely disenfranchised by the power given to others by AI. And then we can say like, well, what do we do with AI then? And what does that mean that we have to do to sort of address that problem?
Yeah.
Yeah. But those are the kinds of questions I think are really interesting. We also had this theological question come up of, maybe just briefly, the one that I found really interesting is how many people said AI is not really intelligent because intelligence is embodied. I just found this so fascinating, the number of people who said this. And it struck me as exactly backwards. But I'm curious what you thought about this as in terms of sort of how Christian theological reflections on anthropology.
That was from Mary Van Emmerich in one of our earlier episodes, wasn't it? Like our second episode in the series.
Yeah, that was just kind of her big thing. But then, and Ollie said something like that as well. But even a couple of other people said it sort of incidentally along the way.
Yeah. I have to say, I don't really understand the point. And this is why I don't understand the point, is because you can have embodied AI.
Isn't AI embodied? That's basically what AI is already. It's a physical microchips and electronic.
Exactly. And
it's a physical
thing. You can make robots. There are already robots that are AI powered who can move their arms and legs and dance and walk around. And so in what sense is AI not embodied? Is that really what makes human beings different? I don't think so.
Yeah, because classically Christian anthropology would say our brain does kind of the rational things, but intellect is something done by our soul. And so it's precisely spiritual and not embodied. That makes us that intellectual. And that's where, for me, I would say, well, yeah, AI is doing physical, rational processing kind of like our brain does. but it doesn't have intelligence because it's not spirit. But I was just surprised how many of the theologians were saying the opposite and saying, we are intelligent because we have brains, and AI isn't a brain, but it kind of is a brain. It's not like made of biological material, though it probably could be at some point.
I should have challenged them on that when they said it. I guess
yeah, well, that was my whole thing. That's why we ended up talking about angels in the episode. But yeah, I was just so curious about it. And I've heard it many times since, that Christians keep saying the thing Christians have to offer is this view that, intellect is embodied.
Well, it's part of that stream of thought, very prevalent in Protestantism, that blames Plato for corrupting Christianity early on, and we need to return to the Jewish roots. And one of the constant criticisms leveled at Plato is that he conceived human beings as disembodied souls, and whereas in the Jewish, Old Testament perspective, human beings were actually embodied. I think that's just part of the in the bloodstream of academic theology right now, and so theologians have latched onto it as a way of critiquing AI because it's there and available for them already.
Yeah, I do think that is exactly where it's coming from, and so I was just struck by the fact that it's a really recent attempt to reverse what has been the core of Christian thought about humans throughout its whole tradition, and then using that to respond to AI instead of what is the kind of core Christian approach. Which I personally find quite compelling. Yeah. So that's interesting.
I reckon it will continue to emerge what is distinctively human. AI is forcing everybody to re-examine and rediscover what is uniquely human. And we may turn out to be wrong about some of the things that we thought were uniquely human. And that's not the first time that's happened either. Like for many centuries, certain standard definitions of what makes human beings different from animals were overturned by careful attention to animal communities among the more intelligent animals like dolphins and apes and elephants. And we found out that things like language and things like certain types of reasoning, certain types of sociality and community, and even compassion are actually there in animals as well. So that's not what makes us unique. So what does make us unique, we have to go back and think harder about it. And that's a welcome challenge, right? Because we're going to learn more about what makes us uniquely human and get rid of false ideas.
That's right. Yeah, which I think is a really helpful. I appreciated that theme throughout these episodes, was that sense of this really pushing us to say, what is it that makes us human? And I think, it's a positive challenge to really respond and say, yeah, this is what makes us unique. And insofar as people are saying, well, this can kind of replace this part of humanity, that pushes us to say, well, what is it uniquely that humans bring to this task or that task, which I really appreciate. And I think that this leads us maybe to the question of hope. So the kind of tagline of our podcast is
confronting challenges to the Christian faith with hope. Yeah.
With hope. Yeah. And so one of the things that I realized throughout this series especially is that I'm obviously quite pessimistic about AI, and you were relatively optimistic about AI.
I'm not sure I would say I'm optimistic. I would just say I'm not as terribly pessimistic as you are.
Not as pessimistic. You at least take the optimistic line often, which I know that you're balancing me probably in part by doing that. But I think that both of us see that as actually a form of hope. So I just wanted to sort of unpack our sense of that, because for instance, when someone said something negative about AI, you often said, "Well, but where's the hope?" And I think by that you kind of meant, "But where's the positive possibility here about AI?"
I hope that wasn't all I meant, though, because I think that conception of hope is accessible without any Christian faith, without any belief in God or Jesus or resurrection or eschatology. So I would like to think that we have a deeper and richer conception of hope than is available to somebody who doesn't believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and because of that, we're all going to rise from the dead and spend eternity with God in infinite happiness.
Yeah. So here's my question for you. Say AI ends up being, on the whole, extremely bad for society. right? Say that a ton of people end up out of work. We end up with a kind of violent revolution. Tons of suffering comes from this. AI is equivalent to like creation of the atomic bomb. Does that mean that there's no hope when we're talking about AI? If it turns out that someone was right to say AI is bad and we shouldn't do this, were they not being hopeful?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought up the atomic bomb, because I think, imagine going back in time to the 1960s during the height of the Cold War, or maybe the height of the Cold War was a bit after that, when the whole of the world was living in terror that there would be a massive nuclear war and that the whole of humanity would be wiped out. And imagine trying to tell somebody there that there are signs of hope, that there may not be a massive nuclear war and humanity will destroy itself. Imagine telling people that in 2026, there would still be more people on Earth than there ever have been before. How would you try and persuade them that there's signs of hope?
It's thinking about hope, maybe just to unpack a little bit about how I understand hope. I think that, Christians have historically said that hope is not a virtue unless it's a theological virtue. And many kind of cultural and philosophical traditions have said hope is not a virtue, right? You got all these, especially Greek philosophers, that say hope is a vice, essentially. Hope is ridiculous.
It's naive,
right?
yeah.
It's naive. It refuses to see reality as it is. And Christians have historically said that's what they were pointing at is true, right? And so it's interesting because the words like optimism and pessimism don't come out until I think the 18th century. So they don't have, for much of the kind of classical thought, they're not contrasting necessarily hope with something like optimism and pessimism, but that's maybe kind of what they're pointing to is this kind of optimism and saying that's naive. And Christians, when they talk about hope, I think that we're talking about essentially two things that are closely tied together. We are saying on the one hand that God and his plans will not ultimately be frustrated by anything that created reality can do.
I agree with that.
And that at some big scale level, God has a sort of plan that has to do with the redemption of all things, and nothing can stand in the way of that. And so there's no reason to ever fear that, say, AI or the atomic bomb is going to undo the work that God has intended. And that could just mean, so that's, ultimately we will be saved, resurrection, something like that. And so hope is sort of only in the life to come, right? And that's sometimes where Christians land is like, you're not, you're going to go to heaven when you die. Maybe that's the hope. But that's not yet
would
fully,
hate you
right?
saying that.
That's right. N.T. Wright would certainly push back against that. And I don't think that is the fullness of the Christian hope. That's sort of the big level of the Christian hope, but also to recognize, well, God reconciling all things is actually, first of all, happening sort of in history, right? The sort of breaking into the kingdom of God. And what that means in part is that we can always hope that, and this is my understanding of divine providence, right? Is that God does not cause bad things, but God brings good from bad things, right? So any evil action or sinful action, God does not cause that to happen, but God is sort of present and active as the first cause, drawing good from evil that happens in the world. And that therefore, when part of our hope is that God will work in and through the work that we do to bring about the redemption that he is working in all things.
Absolutely.
But not necessarily ever in ways that we could foresee, right? So it's not like we can build the perfect political system and that will become the kingdom of God, but rather that when we are faithful in our calling and in our lives, something of that faithfulness that we may never foresee or understand is being taken up and sort of used in what God is doing to reconcile all things. And for me, that means that you can be deeply pessimistic and fully hopeful as a Christian. Right. So you could say,
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Right. Like, and this is where like think of Sam Gamgee in Lord of the Rings. He's like, we are not going to make it to Mount Doom and destroy. We are not going to do this. It's not going to happen. He's fully pessimistic. We can't do this, but he's hopeful. And he's hopeful because he says we have nonetheless something worth doing. Right. And there's a hope there in the sense of like, be faithful in the thing that you need to do that is meaningful, even if you don't think it's going to work out. Right. And then that deep sense of, and nonetheless, and this is where the elves kind of push things, is they have this deep sense that like God is still working through these things in a way that we can't understand, even if Sauron's going to win this battle in the end.
Yeah, that's
but
right.
Ultimately, right? And so I think with AI, you could say this could go really bad and these things could end up really horrible.
Let's pick your worst case scenario. Yeah.
Yeah, pick your worst case scenario. And sort of recognizing that possibility and being fully willing to face that possibility doesn't mean that you're not having hope. It only if you take that and then you say, I despair that anything good could ever come, right? That God could ever accomplish his purposes. That's the kind of opposite of hope, right? Is that if you turn to despair.
Yeah. Well, but the despair comes when you have placed your hope in the wrong thing and you see that hope frustrated. If you're placing your hope in God doing something very specific for you to alleviate your suffering or to bring you comfort, then your hope is probably in a false conception of God, because God doesn't promise to do any of those things. I always like to think, what kind of a hope would the early church martyrs have had when they were standing in the arena about to be torn apart by lions? What kind of hope do they have? And there's enough examples to show that God didn't supernaturally intervene and prevent those martyrs from undergoing a terribly violent and horrific death. Those martyrs did undergo a terribly violent and horrific death. So what kind of a hope did they have? It was not a hope that their life was going to be saved. It was not a hope that they were not going to undergo terrible amounts of suffering. The hope was that their witness would change the world. Because God would use them, God would use their sacrifice in a way that would transform the world. And that hope was absolutely fulfilled, because it was the courage of the martyrs in the face of death that the Roman Empire had never seen before, that nobody had ever seen before. And one of the cruelest and most horrendously unjust empires in the world was converted to Christianity through the witness of the martyrs. And Constantine ended up, making it illegal, making the arena illegal and introducing all kinds of humane and just policies. There's a video on that in Christian Story, which we recently put out there's a video about Constantine and a video about the martyrs on YouTube. And it's a very powerful testimony. And I think we can look at that in today's context and say, yeah, as you say, imagine that everything goes as badly as we can possibly conceive. God's purposes are not frustrated. What kind of a sacrifice do we need to make that God will sanctify as having been worth it and as making a difference to the world in some way?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so one of the interesting things there is to say that sometimes optimism is more likely to lead to despair than pessimism.
Absolutely.
Right?
Well, it was Chesterton who said that actually Christianity
out.
is the most pessimistic religion, and that's the source of its great joy and its great hope, is that it imagines humanity as terribly, horrendously sinful, and that's why it's so wonderful that God came and saved us anyway, or something like that,
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah, so, when people talk about like climate change, they're often sort of saying, well, where's the hope? And by what they mostly by that mean like, well, give us a reason to feel positive about this so that we don't really need to worry about it.
Yeah.
And the hope is you do need to worry about it, right? You have a calling to worry about it and be faithful in the midst of what this is. And of course, climate disaster doesn't frustrate the plans of God, but nonetheless, we have a calling to sort of pay attention to it. And so, yeah, so I think that is, for me, an interesting thing for us to navigate as we confront challenges to the Christian faith with hope, is to say, sometimes maybe we can be optimistic about stuff, but if we're pessimistic about things, the question is still, what does it mean to have hope in the midst of this? That's an actual Christian hope and not
Absolutely.
just an optimism.
I mean, I wrote 2 chapters on hope in my first book on Paul Ricoeur, which I've almost never mentioned on this podcast.
Right, yeah.
But I characterized Ricoeur as a philosopher of hope. And one of the things I learned from Ricoeur is that basically hope is the basis of all human action. Because anything I do because I hope that it's meaningful and worth it in some way. And Ricoeur is applying it to the act of philosophizing, of seeking the truth. That basically, if you despair of the possibility of finding the truth, then you're going to stop doing philosophy. You're going to stop engaging in this discourse. The only reason that anybody would continue to do philosophy is out of some kind of a hope that they're going to find something of the truth. And so with regard to climate change, I would say, hope is the basis of any action in conserving this planet, that it's a meaningful and worthwhile thing to do, even if the worst case scenarios happen and the world becomes uninhabitable or something, the actions that you are taking are still meaningful, and that's why you should still take those actions. And it's the same with AI, although I'm not quite sure what kinds of actions should be taken on that basis.
Yeah, and for me, I would say we probably need a lot more collective political action to rein AI in and to address it and to legislate it and to not allow it to control everything about our society, which is what it's going to want to do. And all of those things are sort of important and meaningful responses to a pessimistic outlook on what, its potential is. But yeah, I think exactly that hope sort of drives us to do, again, that sense that there's something meaningful and right to be done, even if you don't have a hope of succeeding in it yourself.
Even if you're realistic about the chances of it having the kind of effect that you would like it to have. Again, it's committing to God's hands the real effects, right? Saying God has commissioned me to act in a certain way in the world. He has not left it to me to decide whether these actions are going to be fruitful or not. That's up to God. God is the one who's in control of history. His purposes will prevail, and his purposes do prevail in the midst of and in spite of and through all of the terrible disasters and suffering that have happened all throughout history and will probably continue to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that in many ways leads us to our next series, which we're kicking off, called Cultural Witness.
That's
right. And so thinking about, Christians sort of being a witness in culture and thinking about how that relates to other things that Christians have been doing, things like apologetics, public theology, political theology. But I think this question of sort of what does it mean to be people of hope in society, to offer hope to the world?
How do we as Christians witness to the culture of, the hope of Christianity and the hope of the gospel? That's probably how I would summarize what this new series is going to be about.
Yeah, excellent. So we hope you join us for it. We had having some really interesting
we hope
conversations.
in a sort of secular sense.
That's right. We're optimistic that you're going to join us.
Well, if nobody listens to it, I will still enjoy all of those interviews with really interesting people.
That's right. Absolutely. Even if we fail as podcasters, we have the hope it was a worthwhile conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.